Hello everybody. In this quick tutorial, essentially what I want to do is cover one of the things on that list that we formed today, which was how to create a basic loop animation, which might be a very useful thing inside of your pre-visualization video for creating all sorts of things, whether that's small effects or looping animations or objects. And of course, you can do the same thing with, if you can animate an object, you can animate lights, and there's a bunch of other cool things that you can apply the same principles to. So, just quickly summarize what we're going to do today is obviously set up a basic object, use a little bit of the graph editor, set up pre and post infinity loops, and then of course assign a basic controller and place this hopefully on a curve and see how well it works. So what we're going to do is start by kind of seeing what animation we're going to make today. So I'm just going to go quick ahead and hide this information here, and of course zoom up on our main stage here. So just to keep things simple, we're going to do nothing too complicated. To begin with, you can see this looping animation is nothing particularly fancy, and if you look inside my OB, my sort of outliner, you can see I've got this all wrapped under an actual group, because that's the sort of thing I like to see. It's nice and tidy. Inside there is the full package. I've got this little control, and I've also got this mesh. And of course, the reason I keep things packaged is that it makes them easier to do things with later on, whether that's attaching it to a curve or animating that group inside, so that we can animate this group and the animation I've made inside actually stays relevant as well. So it's a very useful thing to do. But anyway, let's get on with things here, okay? So we're going to just start with the absolute basics today, and hopefully not make anything too complicated. So I'm just going to basically hide all of this. So it's gone, and we'll start fresh. So starting fresh means what we want to do is make sure that we create a new object. I'm going to keep this reasonably simple because obviously demonstration wise, that keeps things nice and clean. So I'm going to make this, I'm going to create a torus shape there. You can go to create, polygon primitives, and of course you can click torus. The reason I wanted something spherical and elongated is obviously just it's much more obvious to see is that this is animated. And of course I'm just going to enlarge this a little bit, move it up. I'm going to rotate it with my E key. And then while holding J, I can actually constrain that so that it's, we can keep it nice and neat. And then last but not least, I'm just going to reduce this to something a bit more simple, just so we can see the effect of what we're doing. You can see here I'm just bringing down I'm using the attribute editor, of course, Control A, if you haven't opened that before. For some reason that brought my channel box open. So I'm just going to make something reasonably simple here. I just wanted to make something obviously that it's easy to tell that that's spinning whenever it is, and of course that seems fine. And of course, any sort of final adjustments you want to make, that's totally cool. And let me just see if that's enough. I think that's more than enough. I'll do something like that. Nothing fancy so far. I'm just gonna, you can do this with a sphere or a cube or whatever it is you want. I just wanted to make something that's blatantly obvious that it's rotating. Another thing you can do is maybe just grab one of these edges. And of course, those edges are attached to each other. So one thing I like to do here is just go to Edit Mesh and click Detach. Now you'll not see anything happen, and that's okay. So I'm going to click off the object. And then I'm going to double click that edge again and pull that away. We can see there that it's super obvious now that this is now being detached. I'm just going to, basically what I do is I like to enlarge that, and then at the very bottom one I like to shrink more than anything. So that's just a basic shape, so it's obvious when this is turning. It doesn't have to be this fancy. You can do this with any basic object. Oh, there goes my auto shutdown again. There we go. And ultimately, when this object's spinning, I just wanted to do something like that, and of course, it's super obvious that that's what's going to happen. Nothing fancy going on there. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to reset a few things, okay? So this is an important step, especially in animation. So if I was to open up my channel box, and we know the channel box is where we can see all this basic data. For instance, if I was to zero all of this, I kind of lose a bunch of stuff, which is not really acceptable. We want to freeze this object as it is now, and that's nice and simple. What we want to do is go to Modify, and what we can do then is scroll on down to this very important thing here called Freeze Transformations. And by doing that, we can see everything resets, and this whole channel box is now everything on 0, which is fantastic. Now, if this was any normal circumstances, I would probably be making this object on the grid so that it's perfectly zeroed in the world. But I'm not worried about that today. I'm not working in game engines currently, so it doesn't matter. This is my scene. I can do what I want. But anyway, yeah, and as you can see, whenever we do things to this, we can see all of that information is recorded in the channel box. So if we ever get lost for some reason, say we're right here, we can always just select all this stuff, type 0, hit enter, and it will come back to where we froze those transformations. And you can always do a double check if you really want to modify, and you can center the pivot just to make sure that you're in the absolute middle of that object, which I probably already was, given that this was a perfect cylinder stuff. Okay, so let's get this ready to animate. That's the next step. We've got an object, we've prepared it, and we've now made it super obvious that this is what we want to work with. So I'm going to keep my channel box open here, okay, because this stuff's important to see sometimes. Now we know that the attribute editor, the one that's always open here, is where we pretty much handle most of the properties inside of Maya, and we've got loads of tabs here that obviously do a bunch of stuff. And I guess what's a really good idea even at this stage is maybe to delete the history of this object. So we can go to Edit, delete by type, and then history. And that just cleans everything up. It keeps things efficient. Make sure Maya is always running at its absolute best. So this object, as far as it is known, this is all reset. Everything's ready to go. And this is a good place to start animating. So hopefully those are some procedures that you follow in your own animation stuff. Just rewatch this video anytime you want to just see that whole cleanup process one more time. And you can see it's actually, once something you get used to, it's actually pretty easy. So in any case though, let's rotate this. I want this to rotate, we can see here, it's on the Z axis, just so that spins round. You can see there I'm just racking up more and more numbers. So I'm just going to reset that with Control Z. So what I want to do, of course, is set up the animation. So I want to work in 24 frames a second, okay? So I'm going to go and make sure that this is set to 24 frames a second on my timeline down at the bottom. We can see here we've got all sorts of frames per second, but I'm just going to stick with good old-fashioned 24 frames per second. Now, I also want this to play at 24 frames a second. By default, it's probably going to play as fast as the hardware can probably run it, which is, insane. So while you're here, you might as well check the animation settings. You can see this animation preferences icon on the very bottom of your timeline to the very right. If I click that, we get these bunch of options here. Now these have recently changed a little bit, and you'll have noticed that my documentation maybe doesn't capture that correctly, but the same principles are still being applied here. Now I can ultimately ignore all of this. It's the frame rate and the playback that I'm mostly interested in. So of course I like this, round time ranges to whole values. I'm going to keep that. I want this to be 120 frames to 120 frames, so playback starting at 1 to 120, 1 to 120. I'm just going to keep that there, that's fine, because oddly enough 24 times 5 is 120 frames, which is 5 seconds of animation. That's all I want to make today. So when you're making an animation, consider how long do you want that rotation to last, and remember to kind of constrain yourself to that. It makes your life a little bit easier. In any case though, I can see the playback speed here, which is normally play every frame by default. I now want to change that to 24 frames per second times 1. You'll notice that this is related to context. So if I was setting this to 16 frames a second, you'll notice that that appears here as well. So what happens in our playback speed is defined by our frame rate. But I'm going to keep that to 24 frames a second, which is of course very film-like animation speed, our frame rate. And of course we can say, update view active or all. Later on, you probably want to switch that to all. That means that any viewport that you have will update all the animation. That's a good thing to have on, but I'm not going to switch it on just yet. That can happen. And you can see here looping is now set to continuous. I'm going to keep that there. That's fine. So again, I only changed one thing really here, and that was the playback speed. Keep that in mind at all times. That means that we're going to play every frame 24. We're going to play 24 frames per second as we wanted. Save that there. Now, of course, I've got no animation yet, so nothing's going to happen. But I'm just going to make sure that my timeline is definitely set to frame number 1. And for some reason, it's set to number 2 here. What's going on? And there we go. There. Just double check that that is 1 all the way through to 120, just so that you're not dropping any frames. We obviously want our loop to be as smooth as possible. So obviously I want to keyframe this at as it is in its default state. And remember, we can keyframe by pressing S on our keyboard. So at frame 1, I'm tapping S on my keyboard, and we can see that instantly we get this little red line that informs us that we've now set a keyframe. And I can also see that inside my channel box that it has keyframed all these channels. That's excellent. That's what we want. Now, of course, what I'm going to do next is rotate this in the direction I want it animated, and I'm going to sort of just, tapping E from my rotation tool, I can rotate this, and I can see the number up here, which is excellent. Now we know that a full cycle, excuse my phone, is 360 degrees. So rather than continue to drag that, I could just maybe type that in here, 360 degrees, enter. And of course that comes full circle. Here's the problem, I haven't done anything yet. So let's rewind. Let's drag this frame instead to frame 120. And we can see here, nothing's been keyed yet. That's what I want to change to 360. So we know that between frame 1 and frame 120, this object's going to rotate on the z-axis 360 degrees. So let's hit S to keyframe that, and there we go. I can now scrub back and forward on this line, and that's exactly what's happening. I'm just going to play it with the play button. Here we see 24 frames a second, we're getting a rotation. But something's not quite right. We'll notice that it has this soft start, hits a peak speed, and then stops, slows down to a stop. So we actually have a few bits of work to do here. Now in some cases that might be desirable, but in looping animation we tend to want that smooth transition. So I'm going to have to open up what's called the graph editor, as mentioned in the kind of class notes for animation. We're going to open that up one more time. So let's go to basically Windows, Animation Editor, and we're going to open up the graph editor, which looks a lot like this. Now, with that object selected, you can see, of course, that we have some information in here. Now, I'm going to dock this, right? So I'm going to carefully, drag and try and pull it in. So I see this lovely blue bar that appears just on the viewport. Drop that right there and scale this up just so that it fits. Now, I just want to be able to see my animation, and I want to be able to see the graph editor. One thing to notice here is how the channels here that we have keyframed correspond directly to the channels that are now available in our graph editor. Now, of course, we're not keyframing everything here. We're only keyframing rotate Z, so essentially we're being a little bit wasteful or inefficient, but let's not worry about that just now. The important thing is that we can see that this has some data, and it is of course related to the rotation of the Z-axis, which we can see here. Now this is where we can make some changes. Now, one thing to be aware of is that we can see that this has a curve, and a curve, start a slope here, and of course a curve in here, and that's what's defining that slow start and slow end. So we play that, and then normal speed, and then slow back down. Slow start, terminal speed, slow back down. And just so you can see how that works, if I was to grab that and even just move this a little bit, we can see that slow start and then even slower stop, and then a little bit back in. So that's essentially how that works. I'm just going to Control Z that change because I don't want it. Now, we don't want that in this particular case. So what we want to click here is basically want to change this into a straight vector. So I'm with that selected, just you can always just select curves directly, or you can select them from the side here. You'll notice there's a bunch of these little beautiful kind of connects pieces at the top, and it can actually literally just click that one, which turns it in. You can see here if we hover over it, it's a linear tangent now. And that's all we wanted to do. So now if I play this, it is a continual speed from start to finish, and you can see there that it loops. The problem is that if we zoom out a little bit here, just using my scroll wheel, we can see that this starts at 0 and then of course goes to we know is 360 degrees and pretty much stays there, which means if our animation inside of Maya, which we know is going to go longer than 120 frames, it means after this 120th frame, it's pretty much going to stay still. So we want this to repeat, and there's a couple of ways we can do this. My recommendation, of course, is that you use pre and post infinity, which creates an infinite loop. Now you'll notice right along here at the top of this bar, we've got a number of these kind of little squiggly snake kind of symbols, and that's what we want to use here. So I'm going to enable. You can see there's one that's stuck to one above. That is, and if I hover over it, it should give us the name for it, essentially. These are for basically pre-infinity and post-infinity, which means that we can create an infinite loop. So if I click this one to begin with, you'll notice now that this is now on a permanent scale. It slides essentially infinitely all the way down, which is excellent. And of course we know that there's at the end we have a post-infinity. Let's select that, and we can see that this now goes on forever. No matter how much I zoom out, this is essentially an object that's going to rotate continuously. There's another way we can do it as well, which in some cases is actually more efficient, depending if it's a simple loop or not. But you can see the other snakes, there's snakes that are side by side. If I click that, those instead of the extended snakes, we can see that this essentially resets the entire loop and begins it again, and it does it forever. And sometimes those numbers are actually more efficient to deal with. So that means no matter what happens, this animation is going to constantly loop, and that's fine. So those are two ways of dealing with the same thing. And of course, it really depends how you want to do it. In this case, though, I'm happy for this just to reset each time it changes frame. So again, this is always forever. It's going to just constantly spin 360 degrees on its z-axis, and then at the very end, it's going to reset. But because everything begins and starts at the same place, it looks like a perfect loop. I'm going to, I can pretty much say that I'm done with the curve editor now. Let's see, what else do I want to do? Well, we've straightened our curve, we've used pre and post infinity, or in this case, I always forget the name of this one if it's going to tell me, so probably have to stop this animation. Post and cycle, yeah, it's just a post infinity curve, so essentially it just resets, which is great. So use those little snakes at the end, and remember those lovely little tangents at the start. Really great tools. And of course we can actually edit things in here, if we really wanted to, but we know that 360 is the full whack, and that's what we want. So again, as you can see, as I scroll back and forward from this, it just constantly rotates. That means it's a looping animation now, which makes me happy. I can probably close my graph editor now, so I can pull that out, close it, and be reasonably happy. So you've made a looping animation, but there's the last things that we probably want to do with this, which is just to package it up a little bit better, because we want it to kind of live a long and happy life. So first of all, we want to rename it. I want to call this mesh underscore animation thingy. That sounds good. And now what I want to do is make a little control, because basically when moving things about inside of Maya, things can get a little bit complex. Now sometimes simplicity is best, but I think depending what we want to do with our objects, we want to do some other things with them as well. So in this particular case, I'm going to create a control for this. So to do a control is just an item or an object or a little locator, something that lets you grab that and pretend that's how you control this particular device. So in this case, I'm going to go and create basically a NURBS primitive, and I'm going to create a little circle. And now, circle is important. I'm going to extend that a little bit, just so that, of course, it captures, I think, the main space of this object that I've now got. Now, as usual, I probably want to reset this or freeze this so that it doesn't have any transformations. So I'm going to go to Modify and Freeze Transformations. And essentially what I want to do in the future is that if I ever want to move an object, I want to be able to select, I want to be able to select its little, its control rather than the object, because the object might be doing other things. I just want to be able to use that control. So I'm going to rename that. It's always good to control underscore animation thingy. Now these two aren't related to each other yet, but there's a couple of tricks that I want to play here first to trick Maya into kind of just giving me a bit more flexibility with the object that I've got. I know that this is going to infinitely spin on its z-axis for 360 degrees, but I might want to move that about. But if I start keyframing that object, then I might interrupt its actual loop cycle. So I want that loop cycle to happen inside a group, and I can actually animate the group rather than the object. And of course, it's where parenting and group knowledge starts to get a little bit more complex if you're not used to it. But remember my old hierarchy on the original object. Here we can see we have a group, and inside the group there is a control, and that control is the parent of the object. So whatever I do to the group essentially means that the control will go with it, but it will also affect the actual object inside it as well, which is great. It's really useful. So the best way to do that is, first of all, we want to group the control to itself with Control G. So there we go. It's now group number 1, and inside of it we can see it has this. Now I want to rename that, of course, to, I call them objects just because I love the term object. It means anything, because I might have more than just meshes inside of it. So object underscore animation thingy. Remember, this is an optional part. You don't have to do it. I just think it's really important. Now, what I want to do is I want to make this control the parent of the object. So this is easy, right? So we want to check, select the child first, and then holding Shift, select the parent. I'm going to press P. And there we go. It's now parented. So every time I select that thingy, it's going to move that. Okay, so I can just double check that that's all there. There we go. It's exactly as we want it. It's the exact setup as below. Okay, you can see those are now the same. Now that's interesting because we can shrink all of this, right? And of course I can now, for instance, just double check that animation's still working. It is, but this object is now something I can do other things with. For instance, if I was to move this object about, like move it up here, it brings the animation with it. And that's super useful for more reasons than you might realize. Alright, so let's try that out one last time. If I was to rotate that, it takes that with it. So it gives us just that extra level of control without worrying about how we keyframe the actual object inside of it. So in that regards, it's a very, very useful thing. Okay, but be careful, make sure you're not, if you accidentally select this object and begin editing it, it will have obviously keyframe ramifications. So it's always good to animate the object instead. And so that's how I do most of my work. So can we attach that to a curve? Well, let's find out. Create. Let's go with curve tools, and let's create a EP curve. Go here. Zoom out a little bit. And of course, go and edit that curve a little bit. Edit point or control vertex, whatever you're more comfortable with. Oh, W for move. We should ultimately be able to attach that thingy. Now if we can't, well, then I've done something wrong. But it should be possible now. So I've now got this curve. I'm going to move the curve, object mode, sorry, up to here. What I want to do is obviously I want to attach this to the animation curve. Animation, and then constrain. Now I've got this right, motion paths, and attach to motion path. Oh, I haven't selected it yet. There we go, constrain, motion paths, attach to motion path. There we go. So look, that will now scoot along that, but the animation inside of it is still live. So look at that. Not a particularly attractive animation, but it's still going. We know that by the time it gets to there, that it's at least done its full 360. So now, it's not particularly fast. So let's open up the graph editor. Alright, so now this time I want to edit the actual object's graph, right? So modify. I love this stuff, this is where it gets fun. Modify animation editors and graph editor. Now, we know this is, if we select this pinnacle, we know that it's rotating 360 degrees. What if it was 1080? Let's try that. So you can see here, it's definitely steeper. I'm going to shrink that and give that a play. And look at that. Much, much faster. And if I can continue to edit this curve, so I can grab these control vertexes and pull them out and around. And maybe even different sides, just make them go back. Maybe even under there. There we go. And I'm going to select that object again, sorry, this object again, motion path, We can invert the up, and we can inverse the front. That's up to you though, of course. You can do whatever you want there. I just want to play around with it. There we go. I just love seeing that. Actually, inversing the front's probably not necessary. So obviously now we have is the group is now attached to that curve, and inside that group we have a rotating object. And that, again, on playback can create really interesting animations. There we go. I want to know what 1080 times 5 is. 5400, okay. Let's bring up our animation editor. Modify, Windows, animation editors, graph editor. Oh, I need to select the object. There we go. And we know that that's 1080, and we want to go 5400. Enter. And look at that, we're getting far more spins. And then if you wanted, if this was something you wanted to play blast, we can of course go and start hiding things like NURBS curves. And of course this now looks like it's an authentically spinning object. Excellent. So anyway, there's a bunch of information in there. I hope some of it's useful, but creating looping animations, packaging them up inside of groups and then attaching them to curves can create all sorts of useful effects, and that's really fun. Anyway, I hope that was useful. Catch you next time.